How a mad farmer created a secret route to supply soldiers without being detected by the Germans. The shovel bit into frozen earth just as the flare burst overhead, turning night into sickly green day. Henri Moulin didn't freeze. Freezing got you killed. He dropped flat into the half-dug trench, his breath a white flag of surrender in the December air, and counted. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. The flare hissed downward on its parachute. 3 Mississippi. Voices in German, close enough to hear boot leather creaking. 4 Mississippi. His hand found the burlap sack beside him, the one with 40 pounds of dried beans that 20 starving French soldiers were waiting for, 3 kilometers east in a farmhouse cellar that didn't officially exist. 5 Mississippi. The light died. Darkness flooded back like water into a drowning man's lungs, and Henri Moulin, whom the entire village of Écoust-Saint-Maine had called mad for the past 16 months, started digging again. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The German patrol passed 30 meters south, their voices fading into the network of communications trenches that had turned northern France into a scarred maze. Henri waited until he could no longer hear them, then resumed his work with the careful, methodical pace of a man who had been farming this land for 43 years before the war came, and made his profession obsolete. Or so the Germans thought. They had taken his livestock, burned his wheat, and established a forward observation post in what used to be his barn. They had posted signs warning civilians to stay away from the military zone. They had done everything right, by their own logic. They had not accounted for the fact that Henri Moulin had spent 4 decades learning every fold and hollow of this terrain, every drainage ditch and hedgerow, every place where the ground dipped just enough to hide a man crawling on his belly. They had not considered that before it was a battlefield, this had been his livelihood, and a farmer does not forget the land that feeds him. The trench he was digging now ran along the western edge of what had been his southern pasture, following a natural depression in the landscape that predated the war by centuries. In daylight, from the German observation post, it would look like nothing more than a shadow, a trick of light on broken ground. At night, with the moon behind clouds and German patrols following predictable routes, it became a channel, a vein carrying blood to dying tissue. Henri climbed out of the trench and moved east, staying low, the burlap sack on his back. His knees protested. He was too old for this. His wife Marguerite had said so 100 times. But his knees had been protesting since 1908, and he had not listened to them then either. The beans shifted against his spine with each crawling step. Somewhere ahead in the darkness was the checkpoint, the place where his route intersected with the underground passage that led to the cellar. He had discovered the passage by accident 3 months ago while sheltering from artillery fire in a crater. The explosion had collapsed part of the crater wall, revealing old stonework underneath. A drainage culvert from before the war, before the Germans, before France and Germany had even been called by those names. Medieval, perhaps. The stones were ancient, fitted together by hands that had been dust for half a millennium. And the culvert ran east, toward the village, toward the farmhouse where the French soldiers were hiding. Henri had understood immediately what God or chance or simple geology had given him. The checkpoint was marked by 3 stones arranged in a triangle, visible only to someone who knew where to look. Henri found them by touch in the darkness, counted 5 paces north, and began scraping away the thin layer of soil and dead grass he had placed over the culvert entrance that morning. The stones underneath came away easily. He had loosened them weeks ago, chipping away the ancient mortar grain by grain with a screwdriver he had stolen from the Germans' own supply depot. The air that rose from the culvert smelled of wet stone and earth, cold and clean. Henri lowered the sack of beans into the darkness, listened for the soft thump as it hit bottom, then lowered himself after it. His feet found the rungs he had carved into the culvert wall, handholds and footholds spaced for a man of his height. He had measured them against his own body, testing each one until his hands knew where to reach without looking. The culvert was tall enough to crouch in, wide enough for his shoulders, and absolutely perfectly dark. Henri moved forward by touch, one hand on the sack, one hand on the wall, counting his steps. At 240 steps, the culvert branched. Left led to a collapse, a dead end he had discovered the hard way. Right led east, toward the village, toward the soldiers who were waiting for the beans and the salt pork and the 3 bottles of cognac he had promised them. At 460 steps, he heard water dripping. At 510, the culvert began to slope upward. At 593, his head bumped against a wooden trapdoor that led into the cellar of the Beaumont farmhouse, where Captain Jean-Luc Thorel and 19 men of the 147th Infantry Regiment had been hiding since the German advance had cut them off from their unit. Henri knocked 3 times. Pause. 2 times. Pause. Once. The trapdoor lifted, and lantern lights spilled down into the culvert, blinding after so much darkness. A hand reached down, young, strong, belonging to Private Émile Dubois, who before the war had been a baker's apprentice in Lyon, and who still talked about bread the way other men talked about women. "Moulin," Dubois said, his voice cracking with relief. "We thought tonight might be the night the Germans found you." "They think every night," Henri said, handing up the burlap sack. "They're persistent, I'll give 'em that." The cellar was crowded, 20 men and their equipment crammed into a space meant for storing root vegetables. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cigarette smoke and the sharp chemical tang of rifle oil. Captain Thorel stood near the far wall, studying a map by lantern light, his face gaunt and shadowed. He looked up when Henri climbed into the cellar, his expression unreadable. "Beans," Henri said, brushing dirt from his jacket. "Salt pork, 3 bottles of cognac, like I promised. And information." Thorel's eyes sharpened. "Information? The Germans are moving artillery up from the south. I saw the convoy yesterday evening, 8 guns, maybe more. They're placing them in the woods east of the old mill. I drew you a map." Henri pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the pencil marks smudged but legible. Thorel took the paper, studied it in the lantern light, then looked at Henri with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said quietly. "You're a civilian. If they catch you, they'll shoot you." "If they catch me, they'll shoot me," Henri agreed. "But they haven't caught me yet. And you need the supplies." "We need more than supplies," Thorel said. "We need a way out of this cellar. We've been trapped here for 6 weeks. Our ammunition is running low. Our radio is dead. For all we know, the French army thinks we're dead or captured. We can't stay here forever, Moulin. Eventually, the Germans will search this house. Eventually, they'll find the trapdoor." Henri had known this conversation was coming. He had been preparing for it in his mind, rehearsing the words, trying to find a way to make the impossible sound merely difficult. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "The culvert doesn't just run to your cellar. It's part of a larger network. Old drainage and smuggling tunnels from before the war, before this war and the last one, and probably a dozen wars before that. I've been mapping them. There's a passage that runs north toward the forest. It's collapsed in places, flooded in others, but I think we could clear it. I think we could get you out." Thorel stared at him. "You think?" "I think," Henri said, which is better than certainty that you'll be found here and shot." The captain was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes moving between the map of artillery positions and Henri's face. Finally, he said, "How long?" "To clear the passage? A month, maybe 2. I can only work at night, and only when the patrols aren't close. And I'll need help. The collapsed sections are too much for one man." "We'll help," Dubois said immediately. But Thorel held up a hand. "If we send men into those tunnels and they're spotted coming or going, the Germans will know about the cellar. They'll know about the entire network. It's too risky." "Everything's risky," Henri said. "Staying is risky, leaving is risky. Breathing is risky when there are Germans with machine guns 100 meters away. But I'm offering you a chance. That's more than you had yesterday." Thorel looked at his men, at their hollow eyes and thin faces, at the way they clustered around the sack of beans like wolves around a kill. He looked at the map in his hands, at the artillery positions Henri had marked. He looked at Henri Moulin, the mad farmer who crawled through the darkness every night to keep them alive. "All right," he said. "Show me the tunnels. Show me how far we'd have to go and what we'd have to clear."
"And if I think it's possible, if I think we can do it without getting everyone killed, then we'll try. But Moulin," he paused, his voice dropping, "if this goes wrong, if the Germans find out, they won't just shoot you. They'll make an example. They'll burn your house with your wife inside. They'll execute every civilian in the village. You understand that?" Henri understood. He had understood from the first night he had crawled through the culvert with a sack of stolen potatoes on his back. He had understood when he had seen the bodies in the village square, the reprisal executions for some sabotage the Germans blamed on the French. He had understood that war did not care about understanding, that it ground men and women and children into the mud without mercy or meaning. But he also understood that some things were worth the risk, that a man could live his entire life safely and die having accomplished nothing, or he could crawl through darkness and mud and bring hope to soldiers who had none. That was not madness. That was sanity in a mad world. "I understand," he said. "Now, come, let me show you what I found." The tunnel network was older than Henri had initially realized, and stranger. What he had first taken for simple drainage culverts revealed themselves to be something more deliberate, more carefully constructed. The stonework varied in age and style. Roman-era blocks near the foundations, medieval masonry in the upper passages, and here and there crude wooden beams that might have dated from the Napoleonic Wars or even earlier. Northern France had been a battlefield for centuries, and every war had left its mark underground as well as above. Henri led Captain Thorel and Private Dubois through the main passage, moving slowly, pausing every few minutes to listen for sounds of German activity above. The culvert floor was uneven, slick with moisture and patches of moss that glowed faintly in the lantern light. In places, the ceiling had collapsed partially, forcing them to crawl on their bellies through gaps barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. "Here," Henri said, stopping at a junction where 3 passages met. "This is where it gets complicated." The lantern light revealed a small chamber, roughly circular, with passages leading off in multiple directions. Someone had carved marks into the stone walls, symbols that might have been letters in a language Henri didn't recognize, or might have been simple weathering. Thorel studied the passages, his soldier's mind already calculating distances and angles. "Where do they lead?" "That one," Henri pointed left, "runs west, back toward my farm. Collapsed about 50 meters in. I tried to clear it, but the stones are too heavy for one man. The middle passage goes north toward the forest. That's our best option, but it's flooded in sections. And the right passage," he trailed off, frowning. "What about the right passage?" Dubois asked. "I don't know,"
Henri admitted. "I've only gone about 20 meters. It slopes down, gets narrower. I heard sounds." "What kind of sounds?" "Voices, German voices. I think it might run under their positions, under their trenches. If we could—" "No," Thorell said sharply. "Absolutely not. We're not using tunnels that run directly under German positions. That's suicide." "But think of the intelligence value," Henri pressed. "If we could listen to their communications, find out what they're planning." "We're 20 men with limited ammunition, trapped behind enemy lines," Thorell interrupted. "Intelligence gathering is not our mission. Survival is our mission. The Northern Passage, you said it's flooded?" Henri nodded reluctantly. "In sections. The water's not deep, maybe waist-high, but it's cold, and I don't know how far the flooded sections extend. Could be 10 meters, could be 100. Thorell was quiet, thinking.
Behind them, Dubois shifted uncomfortably, the lantern casting wild shadows on the tunnel walls. Somewhere above, muffled by stone and earth, came the distant thump of artillery, the nightly routine of destruction that had become as regular as sunrise. "Well, need to survey the Northern Passage properly," Thorell said finally. "Map it, measure it, determine if it's even possible to use as an escape route. But we can't do it all at once. We'll have to work in stages, and we'll have to be careful. Moulin, how many men can move through your main culvert at once?" "2, maybe 3 if they're willing to crawl close together. But the entrance by my pasture can only be opened at night, and only when the patrols have passed. If we're going to move 20 men, we'll need multiple trips, multiple nights, and every trip increases the risk of being spotted." "Then we need a better entrance," Thorell said. "Somewhere closer to the forest, somewhere the Germans don't patrol as regularly. Have you found anything like that?" Henri shook his head. "I've been focused on the route between your cellar and my farm. I haven't explored much beyond this chamber, but I can look. I can map the passages, find alternate entrances, weak points in the ceiling where we could dig up without being seen." "Do it," Thorell said, "but carefully. If you get caught, or if you collapse a tunnel in the wrong place, we're all finished." They made their way back through the main passage, Henri leading, counting steps silently, his body remembering the route even when his mind wandered. He thought about what Thorell had said, about the need for a better entrance, and about what he hadn't said, that moving 20 men through tunnels in the middle of a war zone was a fantasy, a desperate hope that would most likely end in disaster. But desperation made men do extraordinary things. Henri had seen it in the village, in the way people hid food from the Germans, in the way they whispered information about troop movements, in the way they endured the occupation with a stubborn, grinding resistance that was itself a form of warfare. The Germans controlled the land and the roads and the daylight, but they did not control the darkness. They did not control the passages underneath the earth, the secret geography of suffering. When they reached the trap door beneath the Beaumont cellar, Thorell gripped Henri's shoulder. "You're a brave man, Moulin, braver than most of my soldiers. But bravery and madness look very similar from a distance. Don't confuse them." "My wife tells me the same thing," Henri said, climbing up into the cellar. "I never listened to her either." The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm. Henri worked his farm during the day, maintaining the pretense of normalcy, tending to the vegetable garden the Germans had allowed him to keep, nodding respectfully when patrols passed his property. At night, he descended into the tunnels and became someone else, part surveyor, part miner, part smuggler. He mapped passages, cleared minor collapses, marked safe routes and dead ends. He brought supplies to the soldiers, food, medicine, news from the village, maps of German positions, and slowly, carefully, he began to clear the Northern Passage. The work was brutal. The flooded sections were exactly as cold as he had feared, the water carrying a bone-deep chill that lingered for hours after he climbed back to the surface. In places, the tunnel ceiling had collapsed completely, forcing him to excavate new passages around the rubble.
He worked with simple tools, a short-handled spade, a pry bar, his own hands, because anything larger would make too much noise, would risk alerting the Germans above. Private Dubois helped when he could, crawling through the main passage at night, spending hours in the darkness clearing stones and shoring up weak sections with wooden beams salvaged from abandoned buildings. The baker's apprentice had strong shoulders and stronger hands, and he worked with the patient precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could bring tons of earth down on their heads. "Why do you do this?" Dubois asked one night, his voice echoing in the tunnel as they rested between shifts of digging. "You could stay on your farm, keep your head down, wait for the war to end. The Germans aren't bothering you much. Why risk it?" Henri thought about the question, about the dozen easy answers he could give. Because it was right, because the soldiers needed help, because someone had to do something. All true, but not the complete truth. "I had a son," he said finally, "Philippe. He was 22 when the war started. He enlisted in the first week, all eager and proud in his uniform. They sent him to Verdun. He lasted 3 months." Dubois was quiet. In the lantern light, his young face looked older, marked by understanding that should not have come so early. "I got the letter in July of 1915, Henri continued. "Your son died bravely. Your son served with honor. All the usual words that don't mean anything when you're standing in your kitchen holding a piece of paper that says your child is dead. Marguerite, she couldn't stop crying for weeks. She still cries, sometimes, when she thinks I'm not listening." "I'm sorry," Dubois said. "Everyone's sorry," Henri said. "The officer who delivered the letter was sorry. The priest was sorry. The mayor was sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't change anything. But this," he gestured at the tunnel around them, at the darkness and the damp and the carefully cleared passage. "This is something I can do. This is something that matters. 20 men alive because I'm mad enough to crawl through holes in the ground. That's 20 letters that don't get written. 20 mothers who don't cry themselves to sleep. Maybe that's worth the risk." They resumed digging, and Dubois didn't ask any more questions. By the end of January, they had cleared 50 meters of the northern passage and found what they were looking for, a vertical shaft that led upward toward the surface. The shaft was crude, probably dug during the Napoleonic Wars by smugglers or deserters, the walls reinforced with rotting wooden planks. Henri climbed it carefully, testing each handhold until his head bumped against something solid. A wooden door, badly warped by age and moisture. He pushed. The door held for a moment, then gave way with a soft groan. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine trees in winter. Henri pulled himself up through the opening and found himself in a small hollow, surrounded by dense underbrush deep in the forest north of the village. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his heart pounding. The German positions were south and east of this location, a kilometer away at least. The forest was thick, difficult to patrol, full of places to hide. If the soldiers could reach this point, they could scatter into the woods, make their way north toward Allied lines. It was possible. Mad, but possible. Henri brought the news to Captain Thorel that night, sketching a rough map on the back of an old receipt. "Here's the shaft exit, here's the forest, here's the German positions based on what I've observed. If you move at night, if you're quiet and careful, you could make it." Thorel studied the map, his expression unreadable. How long would it take to move all 20 men through the passage? 4 hours, maybe 5. You'd have to go in groups of 3 or 4, with gaps between groups in case someone makes noise and has to hide. The flooded sections will slow you down. "And if the Germans discover the exit shaft while we're using it, then you fight, or you run, or you die," Henri said bluntly. "There's no safe option here, Captain. There's only less dangerous and more dangerous. Thorel looked at his men, scattered around the cellar, cleaning weapons, mending clothes, writing letters they hoped someone would find if they didn't survive. They had been trapped here for almost 2 months, living on Henry's smuggled supplies and their own dwindling hope. They were soldiers, trained to fight, but this wasn't fighting. This was simply waiting to be found. "We'll need a distraction," Thorel said. "Something to draw German attention south while we move north. Can you arrange that?" Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold. What kind of distraction? Fire, explosion, something loud and visible. It doesn't have to be much, just enough to make them focus elsewhere for a few hours. "That's sabotage," Henry said. "That's not smuggling supplies, that's direct action. If the Germans figure out who did it, they'll execute civilians. They'll burn the village." "I know," Thorel said. "And I'm not asking you to do it. I'm asking if you know anyone who would. Someone who hates the Germans enough to take that risk. Someone who's already operating against them." Henry thought of the whispered conversations in the village, the coded messages passed through the church, the network of small resistances that had grown like weeds through the occupation. He thought of Pierre Lacroix, who had lost 2 daughters to German shelling. He thought of Marie Dunant, whose husband had been executed for refusing to work in the German factories. He thought of a dozen others who had reasons for hatred, who might be willing to translate that hatred into action. "Maybe," he said, "but I need to know exactly when you're moving, exactly when you need the distraction. Timing is everything." 3 days from now," Thorel said, "February 4th. We move at midnight. The distraction should happen around 11:30, south of here, loud enough to be heard, but far enough away that the Germans won't immediately search this area." Henri nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do. But Captain, if this goes wrong, if people die because of this plan—" "People are already dying," Thorel interrupted. "Every day, all across this war, people are dying. What we're trying to do is make sure a few less of them die pointlessly. Now go. You have 3 days to arrange a miracle." Henri found Pierre Lacroix in the church, kneeling before the altar, his lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps cursing. With Pierre, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. "I need to talk to you," Henri said quietly, sliding into the pew beside him. "In private." Pierre's eyes narrowed. "I've heard rumors about you, Moulin, about what you do at night. People say you're helping French soldiers. People say a lot of things. Are the rumors true?" Henri hesitated, then nodded. "There are soldiers hiding in the Beaumont cellar. I've been bringing them supplies. And now I'm trying to get them out, get them back to Allied lines. But I need help. I need a distraction." Pierre turned to face him fully, and Henri saw something dangerous in his eyes, something that had been ground down and sharpened by grief. What kind of distraction? Fire or explosion, something loud, something that happens south of here on February 4th at 11:30 at night. It needs to draw German attention long enough for the soldiers to move through the forest. "You're talking about sabotage. I'm talking about saving 20 lives. And risking 100 others in the village," Pierre said. "If the Germans figure out what happened, they'll execute civilians. You know their rules. For every German killed, 10 French die." "No Germans have to die," Henri said. "It just needs to be loud and visible. Burn a supply depot, blow up a storage shed, something that makes noise and draws their attention without casualties." Pierre was quiet for a long time, staring at the altar, at the suffering Christ crucified above it. "My daughters were 14 and 16, he said finally. "They were in the church in Bapaume when the shell hit. The Germans said it was an accident, a misaimed artillery round. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Doesn't matter. They still died." "I'm sorry," Henri said, inadequate words. "Everyone's sorry," Pierre echoed, and Henri felt the weight of his own earlier words to Dubois. "But sorry doesn't bring them back. So yes, Moulin, I'll help you. I'll arrange your distraction. But not because I believe in your soldiers or your tunnels or your mad plan. I'll do it because I want to hurt the Germans. I want them to feel a fraction of what I feel. And if that helps your soldiers escape, fine. If it gets me killed, that's fine too. I don't have much left to lose. There are people who still need you, Henri said. The village needs you. The village needs a lot of things, Pierre said. Mostly, it needs this war to end. But since we can't have that, well, we'll settle for small victories. February 4th, 11:30, south side of the German depot. I'll make sure they have something to pay attention to. They shook hands, a solemn gesture that felt like a contract written in desperation and hope. Henri left the church feeling both lighter and heavier, the weight of what they were attempting pressing down on his shoulders like the earth above the tunnels. 3 days. 3 days to prepare, to make final checks of the passage, to ensure that everything was as ready as it could be. 3 days until 20 men bet their lives on a mad farmer's tunnels and an old carpenter's grief. The night of February 4th was moonless and cold, the kind of cold that seeped through layers of clothing and settled in the bones. Henri stood at the entrance to his culvert, listening to the sounds of the German positions. Voices, the occasional laugh, the mechanical sounds of war made routine. The patrol had passed 10 minutes ago. He had approximately 20 minutes before they circled back. He descended into the darkness and made his way to the junction chamber, where Captain Thorel and his men were already gathering. They moved in silence, 20 shadows in the lantern light, each man carrying minimal equipment, weapons, ammunition, a few personal items. Everything else had been left behind in the cellar, abandoned like the life they had lived there for 2 months. Thorel gripped Henri's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Whatever happens, thank you." "Get them out," Henri replied. "Get them home. That's all the thanks I need." The soldiers filed into the northern passage in groups of 4, moving carefully, their boots muffled with strips of cloth. Henri led the first group, Thorel behind him, counting steps and marking time. The flooded sections were brutal, the cold water rising to their chests, stealing breath and feeling. But they pressed forward, knowing that stopping meant freezing, meant discovery, meant death. At 11:23, they heard the explosion, a distant thump that shook dust from the tunnel ceiling, followed by shouts and the sound of trucks moving. Pierre had done his part. The Germans would be focused south now, scrambling to respond to whatever fire or damage he had caused. By 11:45, the first group reached the vertical shaft. Henri climbed up, checked the exit, found it clear. One by one, the soldiers emerged into the forest, their faces pale and exhausted in the darkness. The second group followed at midnight, then the third at 12:20. By 1 a.m., 19 men were standing in the hollow, breathing free air, weapons ready, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of pursuit. "Where's Dubois?" Thorel asked suddenly, counting heads. "Where's Private Dubois?" Henri felt his stomach drop. He was in the last group, wasn't he? "He went back," one of the soldiers, a corporal named Mathis. "He said he forgot something in the cellar, said he'd catch up." "Idiot," Thorel hissed. "That brave, stupid idiot." They waited in the hollow, tension growing with each minute, each distant sound. The forest was dark and full of noises, branches creaking, animals moving, wind through the pines. Any of those sounds could mask approaching Germans. Any of them could be the last thing they heard before gunfire. At 1:15, Henri made a decision. "I'm going back." "No," Thorel said, "you've done enough. We'll wait another 10 minutes, then we have to move. We can't risk the entire group for one man." "He's not just one man," Henri said. "He's a boy who helped me dig those tunnels. He's someone who matters, and I'm not leaving him behind." Before Thorel could argue, Henri dropped back into the shaft and disappeared into the darkness below. The journey back through the tunnels was faster without soldiers, but Henri felt every second stretching, felt the weight of disaster hanging over him like the tons of earth above. He splashed through the flooded sections without caring about the cold, counting steps automatically, his mind racing with possibilities. What could Dubois have forgotten that was worth risking his life for? What could be that important? He reached the junction chamber and heard voices, German voices, coming from the right-hand passage, the one that led under their positions. Henri froze, pressing himself against the tunnel wall, listening. Heard something down here, I'm telling you. Probably rats. These old tunnels are full of them. Since when do rats make that much noise? Since they got fat eating our rations. Come on, let's check the storage area and get back to the surface. I don't like being underground. The voices faded, moving away from Henry's position. He waited until he was certain they had gone, then continued toward the cellar trapdoor. He found it still open, lantern light spilling from above. Henri climbed up and found Private Dubois standing in the cellar, clutching a small wooden box. "What are you doing?" Henri whispered urgently. "The others are waiting. We have to go now." "I couldn't leave this," Dubois said, holding up the box. His hands were shaking. "It's my brother's letters. He died at Verdun, same battle as your son. These letters are all I have left of him. I read them sometimes, when things get bad." Henri felt anger and understanding warring in his chest. "You risked your life for letters?" "Wouldn't you?" Dubois asked, and Henri thought of his own box of Philippe's letters, hidden in his bedroom, read and reread until the paper was soft as cloth. "Yes," he admitted. "Come on. The Germans are in the tunnels. We heard them in the right passage. We have to move carefully and quietly." They descended back into the culvert, Henri leading, Dubois behind him with the wooden box tucked inside his jacket. They moved through the junction chamber, holding their breath, listening for any sound of German voices. Nothing. The passages were silent except for the drip of water and their own breathing. They were halfway through the main passage when they heard the sound, a sharp crack like wood breaking, followed by a rumbling groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Run!" Henri shouted, abandoning silence. They sprinted through the darkness, the rumbling growing louder behind them, dust and small stones raining down from the ceiling. The flooded section was ahead, and Henri plunged into it without slowing, the cold water a shock that stole his breath. He heard Dubois splash in behind him, heard the younger man gasping and choking. The collapse was faster than them, a wave of falling stone and earth that chased them through the flooded passage. Henri felt the water level rising, pushed up by the displaced earth, rising from his chest to his neck to his chin. He tilted his head back, found a pocket of air against the ceiling, kept moving forward by touch and memory and desperate hope. His hand found the rock wall of the vertical shaft. He pulled himself out of the water, grabbed the handholds he had carved weeks ago, and climbed. Behind him he heard Dubois struggling, coughing, the water still rising. Henri reached down, grabbed the younger man's hand, and pulled. They burst out of the shaft into the forest, gasping and soaked and alive. The soldiers were still waiting, weapons drawn, and Thorel's face went from relief to fury when he saw who had returned. "Dubois," he said coldly, "we'll discuss this later. Now, move. All of you. We have kilometers to cover before dawn." The group moved north through the forest, 21 shadows between the trees, leaving behind the collapsed tunnel and the village and the war that would continue without them. Henri walked at the rear, his body exhausted, his mind already thinking about what came next. The Germans would find the collapsed tunnel eventually. They would search the Beaumont farmhouse, would discover the cellar and the trapdoor. They would know that French soldiers had been hiding there, that someone had helped them escape. They would look for whoever had done it. They would ask questions. They would make threats. Henri thought about Marguerite, waiting in their farmhouse, probably awake and worrying, as she did every night when he went into the tunnels. He thought about the risk he had brought to her, to the village, to everyone he cared about. He thought about whether it had been worth it. Then he looked at the soldiers ahead of him, at young Dubois clutching his brother's letters, at Captain Thorel leading them toward freedom, and he knew the answer. Worth it. They reached Allied lines 3 days later, exhausted and half-starved, but alive. Captain Thorel made his report to a skeptical intelligence officer, who became less skeptical as the details emerged. 20 men, lost behind enemy lines, kept alive and extracted through a tunnel network dug by a French farmer. Maps of German positions, updated and accurate. Intelligence about troop movements and artillery placements. This farmer, the intelligence officer said, where is he now? Gone back, Thorel said. To his village, to his wife. He said he had work to do. We should give him a medal. He wouldn't take it, Thorel said. He's not doing this for medals. He's doing it because someone has to. Henri had indeed returned to his village, slipping back through the forest and the fields under cover of darkness. He arrived at his farmhouse as dawn was breaking, cold and wet and bone-tired. Marguerite was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face drawn with worry that turned to relief when she saw him. "You're alive," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I'm alive," he confirmed. "The soldiers are safe. They made it to Allied lines. And the Germans? They'll be angry when they find the tunnel. They might come looking for whoever helped the soldiers escape. We need to be careful." "Careful," Marguerite repeated, and laughed bitterly. "Henri, you've been doing the opposite of careful for months. You've been mad. Everyone in the village says so." "Maybe," Henri acknowledged, "but it was the right kind of mad." She looked at him for a long moment, at his muddy clothes and exhausted face, at the determination that had kept him going through 2 months of crawling through darkness. Then she took his hand and led him to the bedroom. "Sleep," she said. "Whatever comes next, you'll need your rest." What came next was a visit from the German commander 3 days later. Captain Friedrich Weber was a precise man, efficient and cold, the kind of officer who saw war as a series of problems to be solved. He stood in Henry's kitchen, flanked by 2 soldiers, and asked about the tunnels. "We found a collapsed passage," Weber said. "It runs from the Beaumont farm toward this area. We believe French soldiers were hiding in that farmhouse, that someone helped them escape. Do you know anything about this?" "I'm a farmer," Henri said. "I know about planting and harvesting. I don't know about soldiers or tunnels." Weber studied him, eyes cold and analytical. "Your farm is close to the Beaumont property. You must have seen something, heard something." "I see German patrols and hear German artillery. I don't see or hear these days." The interrogation continued for an hour, Weber pressing from different angles, trying to find a crack in Henry's story. But Henri had spent 2 months developing his cover, had practiced every answer, had prepared for this moment. He met Weber's questions with the steady, slightly stupid stubbornness that Germans expected from French farmers. Cooperative enough to avoid suspicion, ignorant enough to be useless. Finally, Weber gave up. "If we discover you've been lying, Moulin, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, for the entire village. Remember that." "I'll remember," Henri said. The Germans increased their patrols after that, posted more guards, brought in dogs to search for underground passages. But the tunnels were collapsed, the evidence buried under tons of earth. The soldiers were gone. And Henri returned to his farm, to the surface world, to the pretense of normalcy. But at night, alone in his workshop, he began to sketch new maps. The tunnel network was not fully collapsed, just the main passages. There were other routes, other possibilities. The medieval culverts and Roman foundations didn't care about wars or nations. They had survived centuries of conflict and would survive this one too. And as long as there were soldiers who needed help, as long as there were French units trapped behind German lines, Henri Moulin would find a way to reach them. The Germans called him mad. His neighbors called him mad. Perhaps they were right. But madness, he had learned, was sometimes the only sane response to an insane world. Spring came slowly to northern France in 1917, the earth reluctant to wake from its winter sleep. The fields around Écoust-Saint-Mirren remained churned and scarred, but here and there green shoots pushed through the mud, defiant and stubborn as the people who tended them. Henri worked his garden under the watchful eyes of German sentries, playing the role of the simple farmer so completely that even he sometimes forgot it was a role. He planted potatoes and turnips, repaired fences, complained about the weather in the loud, deliberate way of a man who has nothing to hide. The Germans watched, grew bored, and eventually stopped watching so closely. They didn't notice when Henri's rows ran slightly crooked in the southern field, angling subtly toward the forest. They didn't question why he spent so much time clearing stones from the northern pasture, why he made such neat piles of them in seemingly random locations. They didn't connect the old well he claimed to be capping with the vertical shaft that led down into darkness. 3 weeks after Captain Thorel's escape, Henri found new guests in his tunnels. 2 French scouts from a reconnaissance unit, cut off during a patrol. A month after that, it was a British airman whose plane had crashed east of the village. Then a Belgian doctor. Then 4 more French soldiers. Each time, Henri used his network of passages to hide them, to feed them, to wait for the right moment to guide them north through the forest. The tunnel system grew with each rescue. Henri and his growing network of helpers, Pierre Lacroix, Marie Dunant, a young priest named Father Benoit, excavated new passages, shored up old ones, created alternate routes and emergency exits. They worked at night, in absolute silence, moving earth one handful at a time. What had begun as one man's desperate improvisation became something larger, more organized, more dangerous. Word spread through the French underground, passed in whispers and coded messages. If you were trapped behind German lines in northern France, if you needed shelter or a way out, there was a farmer near Écoust-Saint-Mirren who might help. They called him Le Taupe, the Mole, though Henri disliked the name. He preferred to think of himself as merely practical, making use of what the land offered. By summer, the Germans had executed 3 civilians in neighboring villages for suspected resistance activities. They posted new warnings, promised collective punishment for sabotage, tightened their occupation. Henri watched, learned their patterns, adjusted his methods. The tunnels remained secret, hidden beneath the surface of the war. On a humid evening in August, Henri sat with Marguerite on the step of their farmhouse, watching the sunset over fields that had once grown wheat and now grew only weeds and war. She leaned against his shoulder, tired from her own work. She had been hiding food and supplies in the house's false walls, ready for whenever Henri brought new guests. "Do you think about Philippe?" she asked quietly. "Every day," Henri said. "Do you think he would understand what we're doing?" Henri considered the question, thinking of his son's eager face in his uniform, his youth and certainty and terrible innocence. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think he would want us to do it anyway. I think he would want us to save the others, even if we couldn't save him." Marguerite nodded, wiping her eyes. "How many have we helped now?" 38, Henri said. 38 soldiers who made it back to Allied lines because of the tunnels. 38 letters that won't be written. 38 mothers who won't cry. And if the Germans find out, then we'll face what comes, Henri said, together, like we always have. They sat in silence as darkness fell, listening to the distant sounds of war.
artillery in the east, trucks on the road, the mechanical heartbeat of destruction. But beneath their feet, hidden in the earth, ran passages that carried hope instead of death, that moved men toward life instead of toward graves. The Germans controlled the surface, the daylight, the visible world. But Henri Moulin, mad farmer of Écoust-Sémain, controlled something else entirely. He controlled the spaces in between, the forgotten places, the routes that appeared on no maps. He controlled the darkness beneath the war. And that, he thought, was a kind of victory all its own. The full extent of Henri Moulin's network would not be discovered until after the war's end, when Allied investigators mapped the tunnel system and reconstructed the scope of his operations. The official report documented 127 confirmed rescues over 18 months, French, British, Belgian, and even 2 American pilots who had crashed behind German lines in 1918. The tunnels extended over 3 kilometers, connected multiple buildings in the village, and included sophisticated ventilation systems, supply caches, and emergency flooding mechanisms. Henri survived the war, though the Germans came close to catching him twice more. The second time, in October 1917, he was questioned for 12 hours by German intelligence officers who were certain he was involved in resistance activities. They found nothing. The tunnels kept their secrets. The third time, in March 1918, a German patrol discovered one of the secondary entrances during a random search. Henri was in the tunnel at the time, guiding 3 British soldiers toward the forest. He heard the Germans above, opened the emergency floodgate he had installed months earlier, and filled the passage with water from a diverted stream. The Germans assumed they had found an old, abandoned drainage system and moved on. Henri and the soldiers waited in the darkness, neck-deep in freezing water for 3 hours before they could escape. When the war ended in November 1918, Henri Moulin went back to farming. He filled in most of the tunnels, though he left a few passages intact, properly shored and maintained. When asked why, he said simply, "In case we need them again." The French government awarded him the Légion d'honneur in 1920. He accepted it on behalf of all the people in his village who had resisted in small and large ways, who had hidden soldiers and stolen food and whispered information and endured. The medal sat in a drawer in his bedroom next to the box containing his son's letters from Verdun. Captain Jean-Luc Thorel visited Henri in 1922, bringing with him Private Émile Dubois, who was now a successful baker in Lyon, and 15 other men from the 147th Infantry Regiment who had sheltered in the Beaumont cellar. They came bearing gifts, wine, cheese, bread, and gratitude so profound it made Henri uncomfortable. "You saved our lives," Thorel said, shaking Henri's hand. "We'd all be dead if not for you." "You'd have found another way," Henri replied. "Soldiers always do." "Maybe," Thorel said, "but we found you, and that made all the difference." They spent the afternoon in Henri's farmhouse, drinking wine and telling stories, remembering the tunnels and the fear and the desperate hope that had sustained them. They talked about the men who hadn't made it, the ones who had died in other cellars or other trenches or other forgotten places. They toasted Philippe Moulin and Dubois' brother and all the others who had been lost. As evening fell and the guests prepared to leave, Dubois pulled Henri aside. "I still have the letters," he said, patting his jacket pocket, "the ones I went back for. I read them sometimes, when things get difficult. They remind me what's worth fighting for." "And what is that?" Henri asked. "This," Dubois said, gesturing at the farmhouse, the fields, the friends gathered in the doorway. "Ordinary life, the chance to bake bread and drink wine and argue about politics and fall in love and do all the boring, beautiful things that war tries to destroy. That's what we fought for. That's what you helped us survive for." Henri Moulin died in 1946, at the age of 71, in the same bed where he had been born. Marguerite held his hand as he went, and his last words were about the tunnels, about whether they were still properly maintained,
about whether anyone would need them in the years ahead. The tunnels were rediscovered by accident in 1989 when a farmer's tractor broke through the roof of a previously unknown passage. French military historians and archaeologists spent 2 years mapping the complete system, marveling at its complexity and ingenuity. They found personal items left behind by soldiers, buttons, spent shell casings, a rusted fork, a Bible with names written inside the cover. They found Henry's tools, his surveying marks, his careful notations carved into tunnel walls. In 2003, the village of Écoust-Sainte-Maine opened a small museum dedicated to Henri Moulin and the tunnel network. Visitors can walk through a restored section of the main passage, can see photographs of Henri and the soldiers he saved, can read letters of thanks from families whose sons and husbands and fathers came home because a mad farmer refused to accept that some men were beyond helping. There's a statue now in the village square, Henri Moulin with a shovel over his shoulder, looking toward the fields. Neither heroic nor dramatic, but simply determined. The plaque beneath it reads, "Some men wait for history to happen. Others dig their own path through it." On quiet nights, when the wind moves through the fields and the old-timers gather in the cafe, they still tell stories about Le Taupe, the mole of Écoust-Sainte-Maine. They talk about the tunnels beneath the war, about the secret routes that carried hope through darkness, about a farmer who decided that madness and courage were sometimes the same thing. And deep beneath the fields, in passages that have stood for centuries and will stand for centuries more, the earth keeps its memories of water and stone, of desperate men crawling toward light, of one man's stubborn insistence that when everything above ground has gone wrong, there are still paths to be found beneath. The tunnels are silent now, empty of footsteps and fear, but they remain, waiting, patient as the earth itself, in case they're needed again. Because wars end, but the land endures, and sometimes, in the darkness, hope finds a way.